So we learned before that Node.js is all about asynchronous code, which was traditionally implemented using callback functions, right? However, in modern JavaScript, we now have some better tools to deal with asynchronous code. And these tools are promises and async await. So I will use promises and async await in this entire course now, well, because that's just the way modern Node.js code is written. And so if you're not entirely familiar with these new tools, well, then please go ahead and watch this short section, which will bring you up to speed with asynchronous JavaScript. But of course, if you already know promises and async await, then feel free to just entirely skip this section. So let's not talk about the problems that can arise when we use too many callback functions. And to do that, we're gonna do a small example to illustrate this effect. Now remember that if you're already familiar with the promises and async await, and in general asynchronous JavaScript, please feel free to just skip this section and mark all the videos as completed so that you can still get to 100% completion of the course. But if you want to learn all about asynchronous JavaScript and how to use it in Node.js, then let's move on. So go ahead and get the starter files for this project from the course files. I already have it here on my desktop, so this folder here, and it's only this file in there, so that's all we're going to need to get started. And I have it here in VS Code already opened, and what we're going to do to start is to just create an index.js file, just like before. Now what we're going to do is this. We're going to use this doc file here, this text file, and from here we will read the doc breed, and then we are going to do an HTTP request to get a random image of a doc with this breed, and then save that random image to another text file. So it's a 3-step process, and all of these will involve callback functions, and by the end we will see the problem that we have when we use all these callback functions inside of one another. Okay? So for that, we're going to use quite a popular API, which is more like a fun API. But for this kind of stuff, it's a good idea to use it. So it's the doc.ceo API. So just hit doc API here, then over here, the documentation. And what we want is to get a random doc for a certain breed. So click by breed here, and down here is the API endpoint that we're going to hit. So it's this URL here. So when you click on fetch here, each time you get a new image. Okay? And so in this section, we're actually going to do HTTP requests, just like we learned about before in the previous section. Okay? So all we will have to do is to create an HTTP request to this URL, and then it will get us back an image. Okay? But for now, let's actually start with the part where we read the file and get the content of that file. So in our index.js, again, we need the file system package or module. So fs, and require the fs module here. Then just like before, we do fs.readFile, and we do the asynchronous version. Okay? Remember that in here, we pass the location of the file, and then a callback function, which will be called as soon as we're done reading the file. So we have our template string here, and then we use the dir name, just like we did before. So the name of the current directory /doc.txt. Okay, and then our callback function, which the first argument, as always, is the error, and then the data that actually is in the file. And just to make sure, let's log it to the console, of course. So another template string so that we can nicely output our data here. Okay, start up the terminal here and bring it up a little bit. And so I'm using nodemon just like I did before, and then index.js. Okay, so breed is retriever, and that is exactly what we have here in this file. Okay, so retriever is the breed that we will be looking for. Now inside this callback function, we want to do that HTTP request that we just talked about before. And there's actually ways of doing it with native Node.js modules, but it's easier to just use an npm package for that. And there are many again, but the one we're going to use is called superagent. Later on, we're going to use another one, but for now, superagent is just fine for that. Okay? And in order to actually download this module using npm, we're going to start by creating our package.json file. Remember that? So let me just finish this and do npm init and just hit enter on all of these. This doesn't really matter, okay? We just want this package.json file so that it actually holds the name of the package that we're using. So we always do that whenever we start a new project. And now npm install, or we can just use di, which is the same, and then the name of the package. So nothing new there, right? Now to use this package, we create a new variable which will then contain the superagent function that this module exposes to us. Let's now go ahead and actually use that superagent function. So for doing a GET request, we simply use the GET method on it. So GET, and then we need that URL. Okay, so this one that I showed you before. So just copy it and paste it here into a template string, because now we are actually going to replace this breed here. Okay, so we don't want that, but instead we want to use it, the one that we get from our file. So in this case, it's data, right? And so like this, we can actually do a HTTP GET request. Now to then get the data, we actually will also have to use the end method on this. And this is then where we are going to pass in the callback function. So again, it's an error first callback, and then we pass in the result as well. And so in this function, let's first of all log the result to the console. So the data that we get is in the response variable, so this one here, and then on that is the body. So that's where the actual response is. Okay, and let's actually go ahead and test that. And now with the save here, it actually moved down. So again, that's because of the prettier extension that we set up earlier. And maybe you also noticed how it replaced the normal quotes that I had here with these double quotes, and also it inserted the semicolon up here. And actually in the last section, or in one of the last sections, we set it up so that we always have the single quotes, okay? And so in order to keep our code consistent here, let's actually go ahead and very quickly create the prettier config file. So remember, that's prettier RC. Then in there, we have single quote, set it to true, and also remember the print width, and set it to 80. Okay, give it a save. Save this one again, and so you see we have our single quotes now back. So that looks a lot nicer in my opinion. Again, if you don't like it this way, you can of course use your own settings. All right. Anyway, this piece of code here should now already be doing the HTTP request. So let's actually test that out. And indeed, we actually have this image here. So actually what we want is inside of this body in the message property. So dot message. So just like this. And so here we have our retriever image. Let's go ahead and actually change the breed here. And I'm not really good with dogs. Let's just use this breed here that I know, Labrador. I don't even know how to say it. But I think it exists. Let's give it a save here again. And so now we have another image. We can actually click this here, and it will open that image for us. Okay, so for doing this HTTP request here, we needed the data that we got before. So this piece of data. And so we needed to do this request here inside of this callback function of the read file function, right? And so we already have a callback function here, so this one, inside a callback. But now we will actually add another one, because now we want to save this string here into a new text file. And so we will do that here, and then that again will have yet another callback function. Okay, makes sense? So fs write file, and then the name of the file, let's call that one dogimage.text. Then the data we want to save to that file, which is res.body.message, and then the callback function. And this one won't have any data, of course, but we have the error again. So here let's just log something to the console like random dog image saved to file. Give it a save, it will then rerun, and here is our image file. And actually you can see that VS Code displays that image here for us. Give it another save here, it will then rerun our code, and now we have a different image. All right. So our code is actually working. Let's just add a small error handle here in case something goes wrong. For example, let's say we add some weird name in here. Run this again. And so right now it's not going to be able to find an image for that. And that will actually result in an error here. So we should always do this kind of error handling in the beginning and say, so if there was an error, and we can just log error.message. And actually we should also say that we want to return right away from this function if there's an error. So it will return and log to the console this error, and nothing else will happen then. Okay? So it says again, not found here, and it didn't save anything to the file because we already returned from the function up here. Okay? And the same actually down here in case there is an error saving the file to disk. Let's go back here, give it another save, and so now it's working just fine again. Okay, so this is just a small example to show you how easy it is to end up with callbacks inside of callbacks inside of callbacks. And that's of course because we already know that in Node.js we should always use asynchronous code, right? We then end up using callbacks inside of callbacks, and sometimes it can go even deeper, of course, than what we have here. You could of course have like 10 levels inside of each other. Now all these callbacks, they make our code look a bit messy, makes it difficult to understand, and also in general hard to maintain. Again, maybe not at this level with just 3 callbacks inside of each other, but if we had it even deeper nested, it could quickly become a nightmare to maintain code like this. And that's why this pattern has been called callback hell. It's easy to identify this triangular shape in our code. So what we have here, like this sort of triangular shape. Whenever you see this, it's a sign that you're basically in callback hell. Okay? And you will maybe see or hear this term when you do some Node.js research or something like that. But right now, this is actually the only way that we know of how to write asynchronous code at this point. But we are going to save that throughout the rest of this small section. So we're going to learn how to use something called promises. And that will then in the end solve our problem and make our code easier to read and to maintain. So let's go do that in the rest of the section. Let's now actually start to learn how to solve callback hell by using promises. And we're going to start off by using a promise for the HTTP request instead of the callback. And this is going to work because the superagent library actually has support for promises out of the box. And so we can simply use them here. For node functions coming from internal node packages like read file, we will actually have to build the promise ourselves. And we will do that later in the next lecture or so. But for now, I want you to learn how to consume promises and only later how to build them. Okay? So again, we're going to start with the superagent library, and more specifically with the get method here, because this method here actually returns a promise. So without going into too much detail for now, a promise basically implements the concept of a future value, so basically a value that we are expecting to receive sometime in the future. So it's a bit like us saying, hey server, or hey API, please get me a random dog image in the background and let me know when you're ready. And then give me that data back. Okay? So that random image is the value that we expect sometime in the future. And that is exactly the kind of request that we're doing using the super agent library in this example, right? And the get method that we use, again, will automatically and immediately return a promise as soon as we start the request. So the promise doesn't have a value yet because the server is actually still getting the data from the server asynchronously in the background, but the promise is immediately available and basically promising us that it will get some data back in the future. Okay? Does that make sense? And that state of the promise in that case, so right in the beginning, is a pending promise. So it's still pending, it still hasn't gotten back with any data. Okay? So here at this point, we already have a promise that we can work with. Now all we need to do is to consume it, which basically means that we wait for it to come back with the data. And to do that, we use the then method on it. Okay? So all we do is to use then, and then in here, we pass a callback function. This callback function will then be called as soon as the promise is done doing its work and has come back with the data. And that data is then available as an argument to that callback. I like to call that the result. And so again, in that callback function that we have here, we then have that data available. So let's take all of this here and put it into this then callback function and actually get rid of this. So we no longer need that and give it a save. Now you might be thinking, well, we're still using callbacks here, right? And yeah, that's actually true. So this does not look like a big change for now, but after we transform the whole example here to promises, you will see the big impact that promises will have on our code. Okay, so that's basically because if we have multiple promises, we will be able to chain these callbacks onto one another instead of nesting them, which is already a huge improvement. Okay? Now, one thing that I forgot to mention earlier is that a promise, as soon as it comes back with the data, is called a resolved promise. So in the beginning, it's a pending promise, and when it successfully gets the data, it is then a resolved promise. However, a resolved promise might not always be successful, because there might have been an error. So we say that a resolved promise can either be fulfilled or rejected. The fulfilled promise actually has a result that we want to use, while a rejected promise is when there was an error. So remember the situation that we had before where we had a wrong dog breed. So in that case, we had an error and we handled that error using this piece of code here. Okay? Now the thing with this then method here is that it actually only handles fulfilled promises, but it doesn't do anything if there was an error. Because for that, we actually have another method. So another mechanism of handling that. And that is the catch method. So right after the then method, we can chain another method which is called catch. Okay, and so this one will get called if there was an error. And so in here, we actually have access to that error object. And so let's now go ahead, take this piece of code and put it here. And so now we can get rid of this. Because actually in this then method, we have no information if there was an error or not, because it only ever gets called in case the promise was successful. So if it's a fulfilled promise. Okay? So this is kind of nice to actually separate these two cases automatically for us. So instead of having that weird handling that we had before, we can simply write all the logic for the successful case, which is the most usual one, because we usually always expect everything to work all right. But in case there was an error, we can then put some other logic down here into this error handler here. Okay, so we keep that nicely separated. Let's change it here again. Give this one another save to run it again. And so here we have not found. And so you see that it actually did enter this catch method here and didn't do any of the things that's in this then method. Let's now go ahead, fix this here, close it, give this one a save, and here we go. So that is how we consume promises. So we started with this method here, which returned a promise, and so on that we can chain the then method, which handles basically the successful case, and then in the end we also chain the catch method, which handles the unsuccessful, so the rejected promise. But as I said before, this kind of still looks like it did before, right? So we still have this callback function up here. So all of this callback function, and also here inside our then method, we have this callback function of the write file. So let's go ahead and fix that right in the next video. In this video, we will promisify the read file and write file functions, which means that we will make them so that they return promises, instead of us passing a callback functions into them. So what we want is basically a read file function that returns a promise and that only receives a file name, no callback. So let's do exactly that. So we're gonna create a read file pro function. So pro for promise, because again, it returns a promise. And then all we do is to pass in the file name and, as we were saying, return a promise. So return new promise. So we use the promise constructor here, which was introduced into the language with ES6. So before ES6, like ES5, ES4, and all the previous versions, there was no support for promises in JavaScript. But they changed that in ES6 and made the language a lot better in that regard. So regarding asynchronous JavaScript. Now this promise constructor here takes in a so-called executor function, which will get called immediately when the promise is created. And this function will take in two arguments, so resolve and reject. So resolve and reject. But for now, don't worry for them. We're going to be talking about them in a minute. For now, let's just focus on this executor function itself, because this is where we actually do all this asynchronous work. In this case, the read file work. So this is where we're going to call fs.readFile with the file name that was passed in, and then the usual callback function. Okay? So the error and data. So just like before. So keep in mind that we're not actually changing the read file function. We're simply creating a new function which behind the scenes, of course, still runs the built-in read file function, but then returns a promise so that we can use the promise instead of the callback function. Okay? So we have that read file function here, which will do its work, and when it's ready, it will come back with the data. And now this is where the resolve and the reject functions come into play, because both these arguments that are available in the executor function, they are both functions. Now calling the resolve function will basically mark the promise as successful, so as fulfilled, and return the successful value from the promise. So let's actually do that. So we call resolve with data. So whatever variable that we pass into the resolve function is what will be later available as the argument in the then method. Alright, so this data here will be the value that this promise returns to us. Okay, that probably sounds a bit confusing, right? So again, whatever we pass into this function here, into the resolve function, is the result of the premise that will be available in the then handler. Now, on the other hand, we can also mark the promise as rejected in case there was an error, okay? And we do that by calling, as you can probably guess, the reject function. So if there was an error, and this is similar to what we did before, so if there was an error here, then call the reject function. And whatever we pass into this one will be the error that is later available in the catch method. So in this one here. Okay, so let's just pass a string in here. I could not find that file. Some emoji here maybe to make it pop a bit more in our console.logs, alright? And okay, that is actually already it. So let's review this here again. So we created a new file. In there, we will pass a file name, so this argument, and all we do here is to return this promise. This promise takes in one executor function, So this one here, which is where we do our asynchronous work. In that case here, of course, that is our fs.read file. Then if we get our data in a successful way, we call the resolve function with the resolved value. And if there was an error, we call the reject function. Okay? And so let's now actually use this in practice. Read file pro, we pass in our file name. So that's this one, of course. And that's it. So this will now return a promise. And so just like before, we can then use our then method on that. Okay, and so this data argument here will be exactly what we return from the promise in case it was successful. So with this resolve. So right now our doc file here contains Labrador, and so this data here will be a Labrador. And so that is then later available in our then handler here. And of course it doesn't need to have the same name. I could also call it like result or something. It doesn't matter. All right. Okay. So let's now take all of this and actually put it here. Okay. Get rid of all of this, save it, and that will run it. Now we get that error down here. So data is not defined. That's because I changed it here to a result. So let's actually go back and change it to data, because here we have data and here we have data. And so this way I don't have to go ahead and change all of these variable names. Give it another save. And here we go. So it worked. You see, we actually got the breed, which is still Labrador, and this time from our promise. Okay, so this really worked. So our read file pro function now returns a promise, and that data here is then available on our then handler. Great, so it's already working, and we can make it a lot better, and we're going to do that. But for now, I also want to promisify this write file function here. So basically do the same as we did with the read file function. Now, if you already know a bit about Node.js, maybe you're thinking that there is actually a function in Node that will automatically promisify functions for us. But of course, I wanted to show you here how promises actually work and how we build them. And so that's why I'm doing all of this here. Okay, so I really want you to learn about promises, not just how we consume them, but also how to build them. And so that's why I'm doing it this way. So write file and as a promise. And this one actually doesn't only need the file name, but also the data that should be written to that file. But then the logic in here is quite similar. So again, we return a new promise. And there we have our executor function, which takes resolve and reject as the argument. And these are kind of standard names, so resolve and reject. You could call them whatever you really wanted, but this is kind of the standard again. Okay, so fs now write file. We pass in the file, the data, and then the callback function. And now something very similar to before. So if there was an error, then call the reject function and pass in some message there. Could not write the file, again with this emoji here to make it stand out a bit more. And in case everything worked fine, well, then just resolve. Now, we don't have any data actually to pass in here, right? So we're just gonna pass in some random string, something just like saying success, okay? So a promise doesn't always have to return a meaningful value. In this case, all we're really trying to do here is to write a file which doesn't really return a meaningful value. So we're now ready to use this promiseified function. But before we do that, let's actually implement the chaining that I was talking to you about before. So right now, we still, in fact, have callbacks inside of callbacks inside of callbacks, right? So we have this then, which has this callback, and then in there, there is another then handler, which has yet another callback in it. So that doesn't really change anything, does it? Instead, we want to chain these then handlers here. And the secret to doing that is to make each handler return a new promise. So how are we going to do that? Well, remember that this function here returns a promise. And so all we have to do is to return that promise from this first then handler. So let me show that to you. So we say return superagent.get and then the string, and that is now a promise. Okay, and then we actually close this callback function here and chain this then method right onto it. Give it a save. Now we have some error here, and that is on line 40. Let's get rid of this here. And okay, it changed the formatting here for us again. That was prettier. And then we actually already have it working down here. So why does this work again? Well, of course, this function that we created in the beginning returns a promise. So on that, we can use the then method. We then make this callback function that's in it, again, return a promise. And like that, we can then chain the next then handler on that. So this result variable here will then be the resolved value of this promise that returned from the previous handler. Okay? Make sense? Now, to take it one step further, we will go ahead and use our write file pro function here now as well. And since we want to keep chaining the then methods, we will again return that actually. So return write file pro, pass in the file name, which is this one, the data, and that's actually it. Okay, so we don't need any of this here anymore. Let's just comment it out for now. Get rid of this space here. And then on there, we can chain the next then handler. So then, and remember that in here, we didn't really have any meaningful resolved value. So we don't want any argument to this callback function here. All we want to do is to log this string, right? So now we can actually really get rid of this. And okay. So down here we see now that it's actually already working. And again, the trick for being able to chain all of these then methods here is to return a promise before calling each of them. So this one here obviously returns a promise here, so then we can chain the then method on it. Then this piece of code here will return a promise, and so we can use then on it. Then this piece of code will return a promise, and so we can use then on it again. Okay? So that is the secret to it. Give it a save again. And so down here we see that the breed is still Labrador. We see that this here is the link. And so let's go here and confirm that this is here indeed the same as this. And so it did successfully write the string to the text file using our promisified write file function. Okay? And then in the end, we have this error handler. And the beauty here is that for all of these chained then handlers, in the end, we simply need one single catch handler. So one function handling the errors coming from either one of the three promises. Okay? Let's actually only log the error to the console. And let's try to, for example, change this file here. Actually, not the file, but I'm going to change the file name here. Save it. And now we see I could not find that file. So where does that come from? It comes right up here from calling the reject function. Okay? So we have an error here because we couldn't find the file. And so we call the reject function. And that reject function will then mark this promise here. So remember, this is a promise. It will mark it as rejected. And therefore, the catch function is called. And so then we log that error to the console. And the result of that is what you can see down here. Okay. Let's put it back. Now it works. Now let's go into the file, create a dog that doesn't exist. And now here we have this big weird error. And that's because we're simply logging the entire error and not the error message as we were doing before. But it doesn't matter. Let's give it a save here now. Put it back. And all right. So now it's all working. And we got rid of that triangular shape that we had in our code and now have a so-called flat structure of chained promises. So again, this is way easier to manage, and I hope you can start to appreciate that. And it's also more logical to think and to reason about the code like this. Now, in the next lecture, we will actually take it one step further even and make this even more readable and easier to use. So stay tuned for that. Let's now talk about an amazing asynchronous JavaScript feature called Async Await. So promises made our code a lot better already, but we can still do better. So instead of consuming promises with the then method, which still makes us use all these callback functions, we can use something called Async Await. That is a new feature introduced to JavaScript in ES8, which will make our lives a lot easier. So usually when we write code, we're going to be consuming promises all the time, but usually not producing them so much. And so Async Await makes that a lot easier to do. Now, in order to use Async Await, we need to create a so-called async function. So let's actually comment out this part here so that we don't entirely lose it, in case you want to keep it here as a reference or something. So get dogpick is the function that we're going to write. And now we need to mark this function as an asynchronous function. So we use async here, and then create the function like we normally do. So this async keyword here simply means that this is a special function that is asynchronous. So basically one that keeps running in the background while performing the code that's in it, while the rest of the code keeps running in the event loop. So these asynchronous functions will do asynchronous work without ever blocking the event loop. Okay? This async function will also automatically return a promise, but more on that a bit later in this video. Okay? For now, what's really important to know is that inside an async function, we can always have one or more await expressions. And this is how they work. So we use await and then the promise here. So let's start with this one. Okay? And then we can save the result of that into a variable, in this case, data. Okay? And so this here will then be the same as having this piece of code. So let's see what happens here. So this await here will basically stop the code from running at this point until this promise is resolved. Now, if the promise is fulfilled, which remember means that it was successful, then the value of the await expression is the resolved value of the promise, which is then here finally assigned to the data variable. Okay? So instead of having the promise and then the then method on it, which then gets the data as an argument, with Async Await, it's much simpler. All we do is to basically stop the code from running at this promise here, wait until it comes back with its value, and then store that value into a variable. And like this, the code is even easier to understand than it was before. And that is the whole point of Async Await. It's to make our code look more like synchronous code, while being, in fact, still asynchronous behind the scenes. Okay? So let's keep going with this and just copy the pieces from this example before into the new one. Okay? So before we had our promise, then we had our then handler, and we then logged the data to the console. So that's exactly what we have, simply in a different way here. So we get our data stored into the variable and then log it here. Next up, we then get the doc image from the API. So we have the res variable. So that would be this one. So again, the result of the then handler. And we await this promise here to come back with the data. Okay, I hope this is starting to make sense now. So after that, we log this to the console, so the result of that API call. And then finally, we use our last promise to write that string to a file. So that is this promise here. And this one does not resolve any meaningful value. And so we don't even need to store anything into a variable. All we do is to stop the code here until that writing process is finished, and then log to the console this string. Okay? So if you compare this code with what we had before, well, that looks a lot cleaner and a lot easier to understand, doesn't it? Now, in order to make this work, all we have to do is to actually call this function here. Give it a save. And indeed, it still works. So we still get our result. Everything still works the same. So that's amazing, right? Just one last thing that we need to do here is our error handling. Because right now, we're not handling errors anywhere, right? So down here, we use the catch method. But right now, we cannot really attach that anywhere, could we? So instead, what we do here is to use something called try catch. And actually, that has nothing to do with async await. It's a standard JavaScript feature. So let me show you how it works. So we basically wrap all our code into a try block. So basically, the code will try to execute whatever is in here. And then we also need a catch block, which will have access to an error if there is one. So if there happens an error in this block here, it will immediately exit this block, this try block here, so this one, and will immediately go into the catch block and will give us access to the error that happened in the try block. Okay, and so now all we have to do is to take this piece of code, so this console log, put it here, give it a save, and now it works. Just to cause an error now, let's change this one here again. And indeed, I could not find that file. So this promise here rejected, right? So this promise, it was rejected, and so there was an error, and right away it got into the catch block and then logged this error into the console. Put it back. And now indeed it works again. Okay, so that is how async await works. So remember, we can only use await if it's inside of an async function. That's why it's always called together, so always async/await, because these two features, they belong closely together. So just to quickly recap, async await allows us to, instead of having all of these then handlers with these callback functions in them, it allows us to make our code look more synchronous. So all we do is to use the await keyword in front of our promise, and it will then wait for that promise to come back with its result. Just remember that this is what we call synthetic sugar for promises. So it simply makes promises look more beautiful. But behind the scenes, everything still works the same with the promise logic that I explained to you before. So again, this is just to make our lives a bit easier when coding and make our code look a bit more like synchronous code. So this is how we implement async await. In the next video, we will learn a bit more about how async functions actually work. So you already learned how to use async await, but there's actually a bit more to learn about how async functions actually work. So let's do that now. And in order to understand a bit better what happens here, let's just try to add some console.logs after and before calling this async functions here. Okay, so console.log. So step 1 will get dog pics. Okay, and then number 2, here let's just say done getting dog pics. Okay, so let's give it a save. And whoa, what happened here? We have these two console.logs before all the logs coming from the async function. So we have the 1, 2, to this one and this one, and only after that we have the logs coming from the get dog pic. Is that what you were expecting? So if not, let's analyze what happened here. Well, as I told you before, this async function actually runs in the background. Because, well, that's how asynchronous functions are simply supposed to behave, right? That makes total sense. So we cannot just stop the code here. So as soon as we hit this function, we cannot simply stop execution of our main thread here, right? And that's the whole philosophy of don't block the event loop. So we need to get some dog pictures from the API, but that's not an excuse to stop execution of our code, so to block the event loop. And so as a result, when the JavaScript engine sees this line of code here, it will just offload the getDocPic function to the background and go straight to the next line, so this second console.log here. So it makes sense that first this string here gets logged, then it will start running this function, then right away it will log this line of code, and in the meantime we read this file in the background, and as soon as that is ready, it will start printing this log, and also this log. So that's exactly what happened here. 1, 2, and then the remaining 3 ones. Make sense? Okay, then let's take it a step further and actually return something from our async function. So I'm changing this here to 3 so that from this function we can return a string which says to, well, let's say ready, and then let's add again an emoji here to make it pop a little bit more in our console. So ready here. And then let's save that. Simply some variable, doesn't matter what it is. And then log x to the console. So let's see what happens. And now here we get this weird promise pending instead of the string here that we were maybe expecting. So why is x here not this string, but this promise here? Well, remember how I said in the beginning of the last video that an async function actually returns a promise automatically. Well, so this here is the proof for that. So instead of logging ready to the console at this point, it just tells us that x is a promise, which at this point is still running, and so it's still pending. So that's why it says pending here. So JavaScript can of course not know that x will be this ready string here at some point. And so it simply moves on to the next console.log, just as we had discussed before. And at the time that JavaScript actually knows that this x here should be the string that we returned, well, at that point, this code here has long finished executing. But what should we do if we actually wanted to get that returned value here? So what if we really wanted to return this string and log it to the console? Well, we would have to treat this async function as a promise. And so we would use the then method on it, or again, use async await. So let me show you how to do that. So instead of trying to save the returned value to a variable, we can use the then method on it. And so here is where we can then call it x. So console.log x, so just like what we had here, and then we would also do this one inside of the then handler. Okay, so let's review what we did here. So get.dogPick returns a promise. Remember that? And so each time that we have a promise, we use the then method in order to get access to its future value. So the value that it will eventually return. In that case, this will be the toReady string. Okay? And so if we want to get access to that, we need to use the then method, like we just did here. And only after that, we then can log the third string like this. So if we give it a save now, like this, it should then work as expected. And yeah, it does. So we have our first log, then all the logs coming from our async function, then the ready coming from line 42 here, and finally the number 3. Perfect, and I hope it makes complete sense to you. Now, what happens if there actually was an error? Well, that's a bit more difficult to handle. So let's again cause an error like we did before. But you see that actually we still enter the then method here. So this block here, okay? So even if there was an error here in this promise, it basically still resolves as a successful promise. So it still returns this value here. And even if we add our catch handler down here, that will not change that fact. Okay, so let's use catch here. And then use console.log and log the error here. So you see that it still didn't log any error. And that's again because this promise here coming from this async function will still be marked as successful. But if we wanted to really mark it as rejected, we will have to do something called throwing an error. So let's do that here in this catch block. So if there was an error, we not only want to log it to the console, we also want to throw it. So we use a built-in JavaScript function called throw. And with that, we can throw an error. So this will now mark this entire function, this promise, as rejected. Okay, and here actually let's not just log this error. Let's simply do error to make it a bit more visible. Then something like an explosion maybe. Yeah, something like this. Okay, and so let's give it a save and see what happens. And bam, so now we have our error here actually. So it says I could not find that file. So this log is coming from this catch block here, but then also at the same time it will throw an error. And if it throws an error, that will then mark this entire promise as rejected. And so that's why we then enter the catch block down here, which will then, of course, in turn, trigger this console.log of this error. Okay, and this, of course, is a whole new layer of complexity. Okay, but it's still very important to understand how this works because it happens in real life all the time. So we need to return values from async functions all the time. And so it's important that you know how to actually handle these returned values. In this case, using then and catch. Now, the problem with this is that it mixes promises with async await. So we have async await up here, but then all of a sudden we're being back to using then and catch down here. So let me actually show you another pattern of doing this. Okay, so let's comment out this part here, not this way around, more like this. And so let's use async await for implementing this logic. Now we don't want to create a whole new named function for this, and so we're going to use a well-known pattern, which I hope you know, which is an IFI, so an immediately invoked function expression. Okay, so in parentheses we define our function like this, and then we call it right away. Remember that? And then in this case, since we want to use async await, we also say that it's an async function. Okay, and so this looks a bit weird here. But if you took, for example, my JavaScript course, this will look familiar to you actually. Okay, so again, you declare a function inside of parentheses and then call that function right away. And so this way, you don't have to declare a whole name function again that you will have to then call at some point later. Okay, now since we're using async await, we're using the try catch pattern again, like before. So catch. Have access to the error here, and we actually cannot omit this here. So even if we don't want to use this error, we still have to write it out here. Okay, in future versions of JavaScript, this will be gone, but for now, we need to do it like this. So this is where this error will be. And up here, we will have all these console.logs. So this one, and this one. And now I hope you know how to actually get the value from the async function. So you know how to do that? Actually, I will pause the video here and allow you to figure out how to do it on your own. Okay, so take that small challenge and I'll be back in a second. So did you manage to get this string here, so this toReady, into the x variable just like we had before? So just like this here. So it's just like we did before. You declare a variable, and then you await the promise. And the promise, in this case, is get.doc_pick. Okay? So this function here is an async function, and so it returns a promise. And the resolved value of that promise is this value here, which it returns. And so by awaiting for that value, the result will be this string. So we store that into x, and then we can, of course, log it to the console. So console.log x. Then in case there is an error, it will catch it and then log it to the console here as well. If we give it a save now, then bam, we get an error still because we had it here. So that part still works. Fixing it, saving it, and here we go. So it's working now as intended. But again, with async await, it's a lot cleaner, looks a lot better, and is also easier to understand. And so we're not mixing async await in one place here, and then using then and catch down here like we had before with this piece of code. Okay? So in real life, this kind of stuff happens all the time. So we have an async function and we called it from another async function. And maybe we even call another async function from that first async function. And so we have a bunch of these asynchronous functions interacting with each other. And so it's very important that you know how all of this works. And again, to recap, the most important thing to remember is that an async function automatically returns a promise, and that the value that we return from an async function will be the resolved value of that promise. And so from there, we can simply handle it as yet another promise. And that's exactly what we did here by awaiting that first promise that we created. Okay, so please try to wrap your head around this and make sure that you really understand it. Because throughout the rest of the course, I'm going to assume that you know how to work with this stuff. And that is exactly why I created this section, to kind of get it out of the way before we really start to work with Node.js and Express and all this good stuff. Okay, so we're almost done with this section. There's just one small thing that I want to show you in the next video. And now to finish this section, let me show you a nice trick on how we can basically run many promises all at the same time. So let's suppose that we actually wanted to get 3 random dog images and not just 1. We could do something like this. So simply awaiting the 3 API calls one after the other. But why would we actually make the second API call wait for the first one and the third one wait for the second one? That would just add unnecessary waiting time when we could just run all of these promises at the same time. So let me show you how we could do that. So the solution is not going to be something like this, but instead what we will do is to not await the promise at this point, but instead save the promise into a variable. So again, we want to now save the promise and not the resolved value of the promise. So let's call this one here result1 pro, which stands for promise. So remember that this one here returns a promise, okay? And if we don't await it, well, we will simply save the promise to the variable and not its resolved value. So let's do that here 2 more times. So 1 for each random image that we want. Okay, and so like this, we have 3 promises. Now, in order to actually get the resolved values, so the 3 images, we create a new variable. And now what we do await is promise.all. Okay, and into promise.all, we pass an array of promises. And so that's going to be res1 pro, res2 pro, and res3 pro. Okay, so again, we have these 3 promises in these 3 variables, and we can pass an array containing these 3 promises into promise.all. And if we then await that, it will basically run these 3 promises all at the same time, and then save the 3 resolved values into this all array here. Okay, so let's actually take a look at that all variable. Okay, so this here will probably give us an error now, but never mind that. Yeah, exactly. But what I'm interested in here is to see the all variable. And what I want to show you is that it is indeed an array, but I see that it's way too big here because it has all these informations about all these HTTP requests. And we're going to take a look at this kind of stuff here later on in the real Node sections. Here's the beginning. So you see that it actually starts with this bracket, meaning that it is an array. Okay, but what we're interested in here is in each of this element, we are interested in body.message, right? So that's what we used to read before from each of the results. So we need to now create a new array which only contains these body.messages. Okay, makes sense? And let's use maps for that. So images and all.maps, and I hope that you are familiar with these all these array methods. So maps will loop through the all array and save the value that we return in each iteration into a new array called images. Okay, and the current value in each iteration is called element, and what we will return is element.body.message. Okay, so that is basic JavaScript, and you should be familiar with that kind of stuff by now. All right. So if we now look at the images, that should, well, where is that? Oh, all that maps. Oh, of course, it's not maps. It's just maps. Sorry for that. And here indeed, we have now our array with these 3 images. So great, there are 3 different images, and now all we have to do is to actually save them to our file. So right now we still get rest is not defined, and that's because we are still attempting to write rest.body.message, but rest does not exist, so that's why we get that error. So instead, what we want to write here is a string basically containing these 3 strings. So what we do is images.join, and we will join them by putting a new line character between them. So \n means a new line. Okay, and so that basically will put these 3 strings, each one in a new line, all right? So join joins the 3 strings into a new string and joins them by using a new line character between them. Okay, and so that should do the trick. Give it a save. And yeah, so now it says random doc image save to file, no more errors. Let's take a look, doc image. And indeed, here we go. And we have 3 different images. So first this one, then this guy, and finally the third one. So 3 different doc images, and we got them all at the same time by using promise.all. Okay, I hope that made sense. And in fact, I hope that this entire section made sense to you. Because from now on, I will assume that you know the basics of promises and async await, and will actually start using them throughout the rest of the course, assuming that you know what we are doing. Okay? And Node actually supports async await since it's version 7.6, and so we can now use it without any problem.